The twin suns were setting behind the jagged cliffs when the human stepped into the silent ruins of the alien village. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, and broken structures lay scattered across the ground like the bones of something long dead. He had only come to this world to rest for a short while before continuing his journey through the sector, but the devastation before him pulled him deeper into the colony. His boots crunched softly against blackened soil as he moved between collapsed shelters. It was too quiet, too empty, the kind of silence that only followed death. He knew something terrible had happened here, but he did not expect to find anyone still alive. A faint sound reached his ears, a soft whimper from beneath the shattered remains of what once had been a communal hall. He froze and listened again, and then he heard it clearer, this time the trembling voice of a child. Carefully he pushed aside beams and broken panels until 4 small figures emerged from the shadows. They were alien children with wide, frightened eyes, their skin streaked with dirt and their clothes torn. They looked at him as if he were a spirit walking out of legend. For a moment they seemed too scared to move, but then the smallest one clutched at his sleeve and whispered with a voice that shook with fear, "Don't leave us, human." The words caught him off guard. They spoke his language, though broken and uncertain, and the plea carried with it a weight he could not ignore. He crouched down to meet their gaze and asked gently what had happened. The oldest child, a girl with faint glowing patterns along her cheeks, spoke in a rush. She explained that hunters had come, mercenaries lured by a great bounty placed on their heads. Their families had tried to protect them, but the village had been burned and everyone else had been slaughtered. Only the 4 of them remained, and the hunters were still searching. If he left now, they would surely be found and killed. Their small hands tightened around him as if they already knew he was their last chance. The human had no plans to get involved in anyone's war or conflict. He had been drifting from one world to another, seeking quiet corners of the galaxy, where no one bothered him. Yet as he looked into the children's eyes, he saw desperation so deep it cut into his chest. They were not soldiers or rivals, only frightened young lives standing on the edge of extinction. He thought of how easy it would be to walk away, to leave before the hunters returned, but something within him refused to let go. These children were asking him for protection, and the weight of those words was heavier than any weapon he carried. Night began to fall, and with it came the sound of distant engines echoing in the valley. The hunters were not far, and the children trembled at the noise. The human moved quickly, gathering scraps of metal and broken tools from the ruins, fashioning crude barriers around the hall. His mind worked with the precision of experience, each movement fueled by determination. He told the children to stay low and keep quiet, his voice calm though his heart beat faster with every passing second. They obeyed without hesitation, their trust in him absolute. He could see the fear in their faces, but also a fragile spark of hope, as if his presence alone meant safety. When the engines faded, the night grew still again, but he knew they were being hunted. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, eyes were watching and ears were listening. The bounty on these children must have been great if entire bands of killers were willing to burn villages for it. He had no idea why they were so valuable, but he understood one truth clearly. The hunters would not stop until they were dead. He looked at the children huddled together, 4 small lives holding on to him as though the universe itself wanted them erased. He tightened his grip on his weapon and made a silent promise to himself. As long as he stood, no one would lay a hand on them. The night deepened, shadows stretching across the ruins, and the human kept his watch. Every flicker of movement, every whisper of wind felt like the breath of danger. Yet through it all, the children remained at his side, whispering to each other in their own language, sometimes stealing glances at him as though he were a shield made of iron. And when exhaustion threatened to close their eyes, they leaned against him and repeated in soft, trembling voices, "Don't leave us, human." The hunter's bounty. The morning light broke across the ruined valley and painted the shattered colony in pale gold. The human had not slept for even a moment. He had kept his post through the night with his weapon ready, listening for the hum of engines or the crunch of boots against the stone paths. The children stirred slowly, their faces still lined with exhaustion and fear. They had clung to him as if his presence was the only anchor keeping them alive. He gave them a small nod, and though he did not smile, they seemed to take comfort in the steadiness of his gaze. By midday, he learned more about why the hunters were chasing them. The oldest child, the girl with glowing patterns on her face, explained that the price placed on their heads was beyond anything she had ever heard. Entire hunting guilds were abandoning their usual prey and swarming to this world for a chance to claim the credits. It was not a simple hunt for survival or sport. It was greed on a scale that twisted even hardened killers. Whoever placed the bounty wanted them erased completely. The girl's voice cracked when she said that her parents had died trying to protect them, and that every adult in their village had been slaughtered because they refused to give the children away. The human listened in silence, his jaw tightening. He asked who had set such a bounty and why anyone would pay millions for the lives of 4 children. The second oldest, a boy with silver streaks across his forehead, lowered his head and admitted what little he knew. They were not ordinary children. Their bloodline carried something that many in the galaxy wanted, though none of them were old enough to truly understand it. Rumors had spread that their lineage connected to an ancient throne and to technology locked away for centuries. Rivals feared that if they lived long enough to claim their heritage, they could change the balance of power in entire systems. To prevent that, someone had chosen the easiest path, offering wealth to anyone ruthless enough to kill them. As the human absorbed their words, the sound of a distant explosion rolled through the valley. Smoke rose in the distance. The hunters were drawing closer. The children gripped his arms again, their wide eyes filled with terror. He knew now that this was more than a passing job for mercenaries, it was a feeding frenzy. Every day more killers would come, driven by the promise of unimaginable wealth. If he stayed, he would be marked by all of them as an enemy. If he left, the children would not last another hour. He walked through the ruins with slow steps, studying the ground, the walls, and the broken tools left behind. His mind measured distances, calculated lines of defense, and weighed what little he had against the storm that was coming. He had survived war zones before, though never against odds like these. Still, the thought of walking away never came again. Something about the children's voices when they pleaded with him, the way their hands clung to his coat, had carved itself into his chest. He felt the old instincts awaken, the part of him that once lived only to fight and endure. These hunters believed 4 children were easy prey, and they believed a single human could never stand in their way. They would learn the truth soon enough that night. The hunters tested the edges of the ruins. Shadows moved at the cliffs, and beams of light swept across the valley. The human positioned himself carefully, keeping the children hidden deep in the hall. He heard the guttural laughter of mercenaries as they searched the outskirts, confident in their numbers. His weapon hummed softly as he prepared for the inevitable. The children huddled together, whispering their fear, yet when they glanced toward him, their whispers softened. They saw no fear in his eyes, only a cold readiness. For the first time since their world had burned, they began to believe that maybe they would survive. The hunters left before dawn, but their voices echoed in the distance. They spoke of bringing more forces, of earning glory by being the ones to deliver the children's heads. The human knew they would return, stronger and hungrier. He touched the hilt of his weapon and made a decision. If the galaxy wanted a fight, then it would find it here. The ruins would not fall easily, and the bounty hunters would come to understand what it meant to challenge a human who had made a promise. When he turned back, the children were watching him with eyes that carried both fear and hope. He placed a hand on the wall beside them, steady and certain, and whispered words they would never forget. He told them he was not leaving, not until every last hunter gave up or lay broken at his feet. First clash, the ruins stood in silence during the day, but as night returned, the valley came alive with the sound of engines and harsh voices echoing against the cliffs. The hunters had returned, and this time they were not testing the edges. They were coming with intent to kill. The human moved quickly, guiding the children deeper into the broken hall where stone walls still stood strong. He crouched low beside them and told them not to move until he returned. The children clung to his coat, but when they saw the fire in his eyes, they loosened their grip. They felt that this was not a moment for fear but for trust. Outside, the human prepared the ground. He had spent the day setting traps with whatever scraps he had found. Sharp beams balanced to fall at the pull of a cord. Old fuel cells rigged to burst with fire. Shards of metal arranged to scatter across the path. The hunters were arrogant and careless, but he knew they were dangerous in numbers. He would need cunning as much as strength. He pressed himself against the shadows of a collapsed tower, listening as footsteps drew nearer and nearer. The first group entered with laughter, convinced that the children were helpless and alone. They carried blades that glowed faintly in the dark and rifles with scopes that swept across the ruins. One of them kicked at the remains of a door and boasted loudly about how easy this hunt would be. The human waited until they crossed the line he had prepared. With one sharp pull, he brought down a cascade of stone beams that crushed 2 hunters instantly. The rest shouted in confusion, raising their rifles, but then the fire from a broken fuel cell erupted behind them. The valley lit up for a heartbeat, and the hunters scattered in panic. Out of the smoke, the human moved, striking with a speed and strength none of them expected. He fought without hesitation. His blade cut through the first rifle before the alien holding it could fire. His elbow smashed into the jaw of another, sending the hunter sprawling into the dust. A third tried to swing a glowing blade, but the human twisted aside and drove his weapon across the hunter's chest. They had thought one man alone would be easy prey, but what they faced was not a man simply wandering the galaxy. They faced a human who had lived through battles that crushed armies. His every movement carried precision born of survival. The children listened from within the hall, their hearts pounding with every sound of battle outside. At first they trembled, expecting that each shout meant the human had fallen. But soon they realized the shouts were screams of pain and fear from the hunters. They heard the roar of flames, the clash of steel, and the heavy silence that followed each strike. The youngest child whispered that the human was not fighting like prey, but like something far more terrifying. Their fear began to change into awe, though their hands still shook as they clung to one another. When the dust settled, only one hunter remained. He staggered back, bleeding and broken, his eyes wide with disbelief. He turned and fled into the valley, shouting that the human was a demon, and that no credit was worth this fight. The human let him run, knowing his words would spread faster than any ship. Soon every hunter in the sector would know that their prey was guarded by something they could not easily overcome. The night fell silent again, broken only by the crackle of dying flames. The human returned to the hall, and the children rushed to him. Their eyes widened at the sight of blood on his hands, though none of it was his own. The smallest child asked in a whisper if the hunters were gone, and he nodded once. Relief washed over their faces, though exhaustion soon followed. They huddled together against him, not in fear this time, but in trust. They saw him now not only as a protector, but as a warrior who stood between them and the galaxy's greed. The eldest girl raised her head and whispered that no one had ever fought like that for them before. He gave no answer, only rested a hand on her shoulder and kept watch at the broken doorway. That night he did not rest. He stood under the stars, his weapon steady in his grip, and thought about what had just begun. The bounty was too large, the prize too great. More hunters would come, not fewer. The next night might bring 12, the night after that 100. But his resolve only deepened. The hunters had seen a glimpse of what it meant to face a human, and now they would learn it fully. He whispered to himself words he had once spoken long ago on another battlefield, a promise that no matter how many came, he would not fall as long as he still breathed. The children slept soundly for the first time since their world had burned, and in their dreams they saw the image of the human standing in the ruins, unshaken by fire or fear, holding back the darkness with nothing but his will secrets revealed. The days that followed were heavy with silence and waiting. The hunters who had fled spread word of what had happened in the ruins, and although fear slowed their return, the human knew it would not stop them. A bounty of millions of credits was too much for greed to ignore. For now the valley remained quiet, but the children's eyes betrayed the truth that they were living on borrowed time. Each night they huddled close to him, and each morning they looked to him as though he carried the weight of their world upon his shoulders. Was on the 3rd day after the first clash that the children finally revealed the truth of why so many sought them. The oldest girl sat before him with her hands trembling slightly. She said that she and her siblings were not just orphans of a burned village. They were the last living descendants of a bloodline that once ruled over an ancient empire spanning entire systems. Their ancestors had held keys to technology buried deep within forgotten vaults, devices said to bend gravity, energy, and even life itself. For generations, rival powers had searched for these vaults, but without the rightful heirs, they remained sealed. If the children lived long enough to grow into their inheritance, they could awaken forces that would shake the balance of the galaxy. That was why so many wanted them dead. The human listened without interrupting. His face remained calm, though inside his thoughts moved swiftly. He had fought wars before, wars started by greed and hunger for control. But never had he stood in the path of a prize so large. He understood now why hunters would burn villages and slaughter innocents for 4 small lives. These children were not just heirs to a forgotten throne. They were keys to power that the galaxy feared. The bounty was not only about wealth, It was about survival of empires and dominance of rulers. If the children lived, entire factions could fall. The boy with silver streaks on his forehead lowered his eyes as he confessed he sometimes wished they had never been born. He said that every death around them was their fault, that the blood of their people stained their hands even though they were only children. The human placed a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder and told him quietly that none of this was their fault. They did not choose their bloodline, and they did not choose to be hunted. What they chose now was what mattered, and he would not let them be erased simply because others feared them. That night he walked the ruins alone, thinking of the path he had taken. He could still leave. He could walk away and vanish into the stars as he had done before, leaving behind the burden of protecting 4 children whose lives drew death upon anyone near them. Yet the thought sickened him. He remembered the way they had pleaded with him not to leave, the way their small hands had clung to him as though he were the last light in a collapsing universe. He remembered the fire in their eyes when they saw him fight. Something inside him, something he thought had died long ago, refused to abandon them. He had been many things in his life, soldier, wanderer, survivor. But perhaps here in these ruins he had found what he was meant to be. On the 4th night, the hunters returned in greater numbers. Dozens of them spread across the valley with weapons that glowed in the dark. They shouted to one another, boasting that no human could hold forever. The children watched from the hall, their faces pale with fear. The human stood at the doorway, his silhouette framed against the faint light of burning torches. He did not speak. He did not shout threats. He simply lifted his weapon and prepared. The hunters thought they were predators circling helpless prey, but in truth they were walking into the cage of a death worlder who had already decided none of them would leave unscathed. The first shots rang out, breaking the night silence, and the ruins once again became a battlefield. The humans' traps ignited, fires roared, and screams filled the valley. The children covered their ears, but their eyes still turned to the figure who moved like a shadow through flame. They realized then what he truly was. Not a wanderer, not even just a protector, but a force of nature that had chosen to stand between them and the galaxy's hunger. In that moment, the fear in their hearts began to change into something else, something powerful. They no longer begged him not to leave. They began to believe he never would. Siege of Fire, the ruins had become something more than a broken settlement. Under the humans' hands, they were turning into a fortress. Each day he walked the shattered alleys and studied the broken walls as if he were mapping the bones of a giant. He dragged stone slabs to create barriers, piled metal scraps into traps, and turned the burned husks of buildings into cover for ambushes. The children helped where they could, carrying small pieces of debris or filling containers with water from the old well. He taught them how to move quietly, how to spot places where an enemy might hide, and how to listen for sounds that did not belong. It was not training for warriors, but lessons for survival. Yet even these lessons made the children stand taller than before. At night the sky burned with the lights of ships descending. Word of the bounty had spread far and wide, and now the hunters came in greater numbers. Entire guilds arrived, bringing machines of war that rattled the ground as they moved. The valley filled with the thunder of engines, the flash of searchlights, and the voices of killers eager for credits. The children saw them from the shadows, and their hearts nearly stopped at the sight of so many enemies gathering like a swarm of vultures. The human remained calm, his expression unreadable as though he had expected this storm from the beginning. The first wave came with fire. Hunters launched burning projectiles into the ruins, hoping to flush out the children. Flames rose high, painting the night in red and gold, but the human had prepared for this. He guided the children into the deeper tunnels beneath the old hall where the stone walls resisted the fire. While the hunters pressed forward through smoke and chaos, he struck from unexpected angles. His traps tore through their ranks, collapsing walls crushed their machines, and his blade and rifle moved with precision born of countless battles. Each strike came swift and merciless, and each time the hunters fell back with curses and screams of rage. The children watched him from the tunnels, their fear slowly giving way to something stronger. They saw how he fought not with desperation but with fierce purpose. Every swing of his blade was not just survival, but a declaration that they would not be taken. The smallest child whispered that the hunters looked like prey when they faced him, and the others nodded. For the first time since their lives had shattered, they began to feel the stirrings of hope. They were still terrified, still trembling, But that spark grew brighter with every hunter that fell as the siege dragged on. Whispers began to spread among the enemy. Around campfires at the valley's edge, mercenaries spoke of the human in hushed tones. They said he fought like a monster from the old legends, a creature born from a world so harsh that even death feared to touch him. Some claimed he had survived fire that would have burned others alive. Others swore they saw him standing alone against entire squads, his weapon dripping with blood, yet his stance unshaken. Fear began to gnaw at them, and many wondered aloud if any bounty was worth facing such a being. The human used their fear as another weapon. He struck only when they thought they were safe, vanishing before they could retaliate. Each attack left more bodies behind. Each retreat left them more shaken. The children watched the hunters grow restless and divided, and they began to understand what the human was doing. He was not only fighting them with weapons, but breaking their spirit with every clash. The ruins themselves seemed to rise in his defense. Each crumbling wall turned into a blade in his hands. One evening, as the fires burned low and the hunters licked their wounds, the eldest girl turned to him and asked why he was doing this. Why would a lone wanderer risk his life for children who were not even of his kind? He paused for a long moment before answering. His voice was low but steady as he told her that he had seen too many innocents abandoned in the face of greed and cruelty. He said he had walked away before and it had haunted him. This time he would not walk away. His words sank deep into the children's hearts, filling them with a warmth stronger than any fire. They realized he was not bound to them by blood or duty. He stayed because he chose to, and that choice was more powerful than any crown or throne. The siege did not end. More hunters kept arriving, their eyes burning with the lust for credits, their machines grinding closer to the heart of the ruins. But now the children no longer whispered in despair. They looked at the human and saw not just a protector but a symbol of defiance. The bounty had brought an army, but the galaxy would soon learn that against a single human's resolve, even an army could bleed betrayal and loss. The ruins echoed with the quiet after days of battle. Smoke curled into the sky and the ground was blackened from fire and blood. The hunters had been pushed back again, their machines shattered and their bodies left where they fell. But the human knew they would not give up. The bounty was too large and greed never slept. Still, he allowed the children a moment of rest. They huddled near the old hall, exhausted but alive, whispering to each other in their soft language, their eyes filled with both fear and pride. They had seen him fight through storms of fire and stand unbroken, and they clung to that image as if it was a shield that nothing could pierce. On the 7th day of the siege, a stranger approached the ruins. He came unarmed, his hands raised in a gesture of peace, his face marked with sorrow. He said he was a traveler who had once known their people, and that he had come not for the bounty but to help them escape. His words were smooth and gentle, and the children looked to the human with hope. Perhaps, they thought, here was finally someone who could guide them away from the endless violence. The human studied the stranger with cold eyes, his instincts screaming caution, but he did not stop the man from speaking. He listened, silent and unyielding, while the stranger promised safe passage through hidden tunnels and a ship waiting beyond the cliffs. The children begged him to trust the stranger. Their voices trembled as they pleaded that maybe this was the chance they had prayed for. Against his own judgment, the human agreed to test the stranger's path. He moved carefully, never lowering his weapon, guiding the children into the tunnels the man had shown. For a time it seemed real, the path twisting deep beneath the ruins, cool air brushing against their skin as though freedom waited at the end. But then the echo of movement betrayed the truth. Dozens of hunters stepped from the shadows, weapons raised, eyes gleaming with triumph. The stranger's sorrowful face twisted into a grin of greed. The trap was sprung. The children cried out in terror as the hunters surged forward. The human moved faster than thought, pulling them behind him as he raised his weapon. Fire exploded in the tunnels, the sound deafening, the light blinding. The hunters pressed in from every side, their voices filled with certainty that the fight was finally over. But they had underestimated the fury of a human betrayed. He fought with a rage the children had never seen, every strike sharper, every movement fueled by cold anger. The tunnels shook with violence, bodies falling one after another, screams echoing in the dark. Yet even with his strength, the numbers were overwhelming, and in the chaos one of the children was struck. The youngest boy collapsed with a cry, blood staining his side. The human's heart turned to ice. For a moment time seemed to slow, the cries of the children echoing through his skull. Something inside him broke loose, something he had held chained for years. His movements became terrifying, his strikes unstoppable. Hunters who had once laughed at the thought of easy prey now screamed in terror as he tore through them. The stranger tried to flee, but the human caught him with one hand and ended his life without a word. No betrayal would stand. No debt of blood would go unpaid. When the last hunter fell, the tunnels were silent except for the heavy sound of the human's breathing and the quiet sobs of the children. He lifted the wounded boy in his arms, his expression grim but unshaken. The wound was deep, but the boy was alive. The human bound it with steady hands, refusing to let fear show in his face. He told the children their brother would live because he would not allow anything else. His voice was cold and steady, and they believed him. They had seen what he became when one of them was harmed, and they knew no force in the galaxy could withstand that fury. Outside the ruins, whispers spread faster than ever. Survivors spoke of the slaughter in the tunnels, of hunters broken like twigs, of a human who moved like a storm of steel and fire. Fear began to outweigh greed, and some hunters abandoned the bounty, deciding that no credit was worth facing the demon who defended the children. Yet the largest forces had not yet arrived. Armies still gathered, lords and guilds still prepared, and the bounty still gleamed like a promise in the darkness. The final storm was coming. That night the children sat close to the human, their wounded brother resting against his chest. Their eyes were wide with awe and fear, for they had seen the mask slip and the truth beneath. He was not only their protector, but something far greater, something the galaxy had whispered about but never truly believed. They understood now why humans were feared, and they knew the hunters who still came would soon learn that lesson too. The final stand. The valley was silent after the betrayal, but it was the silence that came before a great storm. The human stood at the edge of the ruins with the children behind him, watching the horizon as dozens of ships descended from the sky. They were not the scattered bands of hunters that had come before. This was a fleet, the largest force yet, drawn together by the promise of millions of credits. Armored carriers rumbled across the plains, engines shook the earth, and the sky burned with the glow of engines. The children stared in horror at the endless wave of enemies. Even after all they had seen, even after the battle survived, they wondered if this time it was too much. Yet when they looked at the human, they saw no fear. His stance was steady, his eyes sharp, his grip on his weapon firm. He was one man against an army. But he stood as if he had never known the meaning of surrender. The siege began with thunder. Fire rained down from the ships, explosions ripped through the ruins, and hunters advanced in waves. The children were hidden deep inside the hall beneath layers of stone, their wounded brother resting in the arms of the eldest sister. She whispered to him that the human was out there fighting for them, that no fire could burn him and no army could break him. Her words shook with fear but also with faith. She had seen him fight too many times to doubt now outside. The human unleashed everything he had prepared. Traps erupted in fire and stone, collapsing entire squads before they reached the walls. He moved through smoke and ash like a shadow, striking with precision, vanishing before they could surround him. His rifle barked until it burned hot in his hands. His blade cut through steel and flesh alike. He was a storm-given flesh, his fury carrying him through the endless tide. The hunters shouted in disbelief as their numbers fell again and again. They cursed the bounty that had lured them here. They cursed the name human, and still they came, driven by greed that blinded them to the truth. Hours passed in chaos. The ruins shook under the weight of battle. Walls crumbled, and the air was thick with fire. The human's body carried wounds, blood staining his clothes, but his steps never faltered. Each cut, each bruise only fueled his resolve. He remembered the plea that had started it all, the trembling voices of 4 children begging him not to leave. That memory burned brighter than any pain, pushing him forward when exhaustion threatened to break him. He would not leave. He would not fail. As long as he still breathed, no hand would touch them. At last the fleet made its final push. Dozens of armored hunters stormed the ruins, their machines spitting fire, their voices raised in triumph. They believed they had cornered him, that no man could hold against so many. But the human did not stand cornered. He stood in the open with his weapon raised, eyes burning with defiance. With a roar that echoed across the valley, he charged. The ground shook beneath the clash, fire and steel colliding in a storm of death. When the smoke cleared, silence fell again. The machines lay broken, the hunters scattered and lifeless, and in the center of it all the human still stood, bloodied and scarred but unbowed. The final assault had failed. The bounty that had promised wealth had become a grave for those who sought it. The children emerged from the hall when the last echoes of battle faded. Their eyes filled with tears as they ran to him. The wounded boy leaned against his sister, but even he managed to smile at the sight of their protector still alive. They wrapped their arms around him, their voices trembling with gratitude. They whispered again the words that had bound them together since the beginning, words that carried both love and sorrow. "Don't leave us, human," they said. And he knelt among them, weary but unbroken, and told them he never would. That night the valley was quiet once more. No hunters remained. No machines prowled the ruins, only the stars watching from above. Around their small fire the children leaned close to him, their faces lit by the glow, their eyes heavy with sleep. He kept his watch as always, though his body ached with pain. He thought of the battles fought, of the countless hunters who had fallen, of the millions of credits still hanging in the air like a curse. But none of it mattered now. What mattered were the 4 children who breathed safely beside him, alive because he had chosen to stay. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound of their soft voices ease the weight of war. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And so the story ended where it had begun, with 4 children and 1 man, bound by a promise that no galaxy could break. The final stand. The ruins lay heavy with silence as the hunters gathered for their greatest assault. From every corner of the sector they had come, driven by greed and the promise of millions, their ships filling the skies like a storm of steel. The children huddled deep within the broken hall, their voices whispering prayers they barely understood, while outside the human stood alone against the horizon of fire. He carried wounds from countless battles, his body aching, but his spirit burned stronger than ever. He had given them his word, and that word was iron. The hunters advanced with machines that crushed stone beneath their weight, with weapons glowing bright enough to cut through walls, with voices raised in laughter, certain that no single defender could hold against them. Yet when they entered the ruins, they found not prey but a battlefield prepared by cunning hands and an unyielding will. Traps ignited with thunder, walls fell to bury squads in flame, shadows moved where no one should have stood. And at the heart of it all, the human struck, his blade flashing through smoke, his rifle cutting through armored foes, his steps sure even as blood ran from his side. The children listened to the storm above them, every scream and explosion carried to their ears. And though fear twisted their hearts, they began to feel something else rising stronger than terror. They remembered how he had stood against the first hunters, how he had refused to leave even when betrayal nearly destroyed them, how his fury had torn through armies that should have been unstoppable. They whispered to each other that he was not fighting for himself but for them, and that no force in the galaxy could match a human who had chosen to protect. The battle raged through the night until the very earth seemed to shake. The hunters came in endless waves, their numbers greater than any before, but each wave broke against him like water against stone. He fought with a strength beyond reason, with rage honed into precision, with a heart that refused to yield. At last the final machine fell burning to the ground, its wreckage lighting the valley in orange flame, and silence spread where once had been chaos. The hunters were gone, their greed buried with them, and only the human remained standing, bloodied but alive, his breath heavy yet his eyes unbroken. When the children emerged, they ran to him with tears streaming down their faces. They clung to him, their voices trembling with relief, whispering again the words they had spoken since the night they first met him. "Do not leave us, human," they said, their voices breaking with both fear and love. And he knelt among them, placing his hand upon their shoulders, and told them he would never leave, that as long as he drew breath they would never be alone. His words were quiet, yet they carried the weight of truth stronger than any oath carved in stone. That night they sat together beneath the stars, the ruins glowing faintly from the fires of battle. The children leaned close to him, their small bodies heavy with exhaustion, their trust complete. He watched the skies as he always did, his weapon beside him, his eyes sharp even in the stillness, yet for the first time he allowed himself to feel peace. He had stood against the galaxy and he had not fallen. The children were alive, their future still burning bright, and that was victory enough. The promise he had made had been kept, and nothing could take that from them now. The end.